All right. So last week we talked about Ruth chapter 1. Super quick. Can anyone recap highlights, things you took away from last week, just so we can touch base before we move into chapter 2? So Ruth chapter 1. There's Naomi. She has 2 daughters-in-law, and their names are Ruth and Orpah. And what happened to all the men in their family? They expired. They're no longer here. And it was actually really sad. And we talked a lot about grief, how these women got together to share their grief and openly process this grief, and how selflessly Naomi tried to act with her daughters-in-law, and how selflessly Ruth did act with her mother-in-law. We talked about how Orpah left, how that isn't necessarily wrong, but that the fact that Ruth stayed, she was able to reap spiritual benefits that we'll see through the rest of the book. So chapter 2, let me pull this up. Chapter 2. So I kind of gave a bit of a warning on Facebook, and some of you might deem it as unnecessary, and that's totally fine. But Ruth chapter 2, we will come upon the theme of like sexual assault, and so that can be really sensitive for some, but especially in general can catch you off guard. So that is going to come a little bit later in the lesson. So just kind of, it's a very important part of Ruth chapter 2. And it's a part that God is very present for, and that's why we're going to talk about it. So I'll start reading Ruth chapter 2, and I like to read out of the ESV. Now Naomi had a relative of her husband's, a worthy man of the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, "Let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after him, in whose sight I shall find favor." And she said to her, "Go, my daughter." So what is the practice of gleaning? How familiar are you with gleaning? What is gleaning?
It was like the outskirts of the fields that people left. God told people to leave them for like the poor, the widows.
Right.
People that couldn't grow around.
Right. Gleaning was basically like God's institution of a welfare system of a sort. It was a way that the poor could eat, and they would be working for what they're eating. It's a whole concept I was reading about online called the theology of work. People explore this idea. There's a theology of everything. I have a book at home called The Theology of Food, and I'm really excited to read it. But this is about the theology of work, and it really reflects on how we can help people. Part of the way we help people, this example, we're being instructed to be better at helping people. God was trying to help people be better at helping people. This practice of gleaning, of picking up what's left over from the harvesters, like the paid workers, this isn't a... Well, let me see. I'm trying to decide maybe we should just read through everything first.
They do that in Palmer with the potato fields.
Do they really?
Mm-hmm.
I didn't know that.
They clean the fields after the tractor is gone through.
Is that like an individual decision, or is that like a citywide? What is that?
It's probably individual.
Okay, like per farmer.
You can find a place that'll let you and your kids just go.
That is so neat.
Laying on the ground stuff.
That's really neat. I didn't know that.
They like potatoes.
Yeah. In Coopertown, it's a big tobacco farming community, which is more and more restricted with the way the government's starting to control who can and can't tobacco farm. But a lot of people will run behind tobacco trucks after they've harvested it and smoked it in the barns to get the smoked leaves because they smell so good. They're so sweet because it's before it's been anything. And so it smells really good, but people run behind the trucks or walk through the fields and pick them up and crush it and make it into candles and stuff like that. But I guess that's Coopertown gleaning. Trying to decide if I want to read through the rest of this. No, we'll go ahead. So gleaning, this institution of gleaning, isn't a you don't deserve my help. Like it speaks to how we should help other people. It's not a you don't deserve my help since your condition is a result of you not working, but it causes us to really look more inward and have self-criticism at a welfare system. I think I want to read through the whole thing and then we'll go back and talk about that though. Let me scroll. Okay. So Naomi said, "Go, my daughter," blah, 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 blah. So verse 3, so she set out and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers, and she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the clan of Elimelech. And behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem, and he said to the reapers, "The Lord be with you." And they answered, "The Lord bless you." Then Boaz said to his young man who was in charge of the reapers, "Whose young woman is this?" And the servant who was in charge of the reapers answered, "She is the young Moabite woman who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab." She said, "Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves after the reapers." So she came, and she's continued from early morning until now, except for a short rest. Then Boaz said to Ruth, "Now listen, my daughter, do not glean in another field or leave this one, but keep close to my young women. Let your eyes be on the field and that they are reaping, and go after them. Have I not charged the young men not to touch you? And when you are thirsty, go to the vessels and drink what the young men have drawn." Okay, so we will stop there. Let's go back to the gleaning section. So we've talked about what gleaning is. So ancient methods of harvesting are not as efficient as today, yet Leviticus 19:9-10 instructs Israelites to make them even less efficient. First, they were to leave the margins of their grain fields unharvested. The width of this margin appears to be up to the owner's discretion. Secondly, they were not to pick up whatever produce fell to the ground. So this would apply when a harvester grafts like a bunch of stalks and cut them with a sickle, as well as when grapes fell from a cluster just cut from a vine. Thirdly, they were to harvest their vineyards just once, presumably taking only the ripe grapes, so as to leave the later ripening ones for their poor and the immigrants living among them. These two categories of people, the poor and the resident foreigners, were unified by their lack of owning land, and thus were dependent on their own manual labor for food. Laws benefiting the poor were common in the ancient Near East, but only the regulations of Israel extended this treatment to the resident foreigner, which I thought was interesting. This was yet another way that God's people were to be distinct from the surrounding nations. Other texts also specify the widow and the orphan as members of the marginalized category. We might classify gleaning as an expression of compassion or justice, but according to Leviticus, allowing others to glean on our property is the fruit of holiness. We do it because God says, "I am the Lord your God." This highlights the distinction between charity and gleaning. In charity, people voluntarily give to others who are in need. This is a good and noble thing to do, but this is not what Leviticus is talking about. Gleaning is a process in which landowners have an obligation to provide poor and marginalized people access to the means of production. In Leviticus, this is the land, and to work it themselves. Unlike charity, it does not depend upon the generosity of landowners. In this sense, it is much more like a tax than it is a charitable contribution. Also, unlike charity, it was not given to the poor as a transfer payment. This is a lot of text, I know, but I think this is really important. Through gleaning, the poor earned their living the same way as the landowners did, by working the fields with their own labors. It was simply a command that everyone had a right to access the means of provision created by God. So this kind of, okay, we get how and why that was implemented. But I think that you can the Bible can teach you anything about any part of your life. So I look at this. How does this inform the way I look at a welfare system or a work ethic? The gleaning system in Leviticus does place an obligation on the owners of productive assets to ensure that marginalized people have the opportunity to work for a living. No individual owner can provide opportunities for every unemployed or underemployed worker, of course. No more than any one farmer in ancient Israel could provide gleanings for the entire district. But owners are called to be the point people in providing opportunities for work. And I think that's like the thesis statement. Owners are called to be the point people in providing opportunities for work. So my job is let me create as many opportunities as possible to let people contribute to their own progress. When I think about Wasilla, like think homeless shelters, well-run homeless shelters, are a very good example of what this functionally is supposed to look like. A well-run homeless shelter helps people get an ID, helps them with any acute medical issues, even chronic medical issues they have that might prevent them from working. It helps them to get a job. And in effect, it teaches them how to fish. You see halfway houses or even offenders who are still in prison who are part of training programs with the vision of the future in mind. What am I going to be like when I move through this process, when I'm on my own feet? The idea is to teach someone how to fish. In gleaning, you don't work, get a pat on the back, good job, and then hand your food over. You get to eat. You keep it. We cannot expect people to go from homeless to fully employed with a 3-bedroom, 2-bath house. Just like that. We have to help them navigate through the process while also giving them somewhere to be. If they glean, they keep their food. If we are the ones who have, we must go the extra mile and teach others how to have as well, while also ensuring that they are kept and cared for as they learn. Pulling yourself up by your bootstraps is impossible when you don't own boots. So this idea of gleaning teaches me how to share what I have and teach others how to have as well, letting them earn as I have earned. I would also like to point out, this does not negate the times in the Bible where we are freely given. Christ gave us eternal life paid in full. It's not a requirement to work for every single thing you own and benefit from in life. Handouts are ultimately not sustainable for an individual and do not enable them to eventually give to others themselves. But it is not a sin to receive a handout, right? So that was a whole lot, sort of an aside, but I think that this little gleaning institution we touch on, that's Ruth's in, right, to move forward for herself. When I take it and I sit with it, because I mean this potato thing, I didn't even know about that. And I'm not like a barley person, so I'm not like seeking out barley fields or whatever, but like this section teaches us a God-instituted welfare system that is sustainable and functional and dignifying as well. It teaches people who are in want, perhaps systems they can seek out and look for that are helpful, but also it teaches me, someone who has, how to appropriately give. Have y'all heard of the book When Helping Hurts? There's a book called When Helping Hurts, and I haven't read the whole thing. But just the concept of instituting systems to teach people and help people that don't enable or hurt them. Teach people how to fish, and make sure that they're eating while they're learning how to fish too. So anyways, let's go on to verse 3. Now I'm going to read this part again. So she set out, Ruth, and gleaned in the field after the reapers. And she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz. I don't think that was a coincidence. Who was of the clan of Elimelech. And behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem. And we read this, and he was like, the Lord be with you. And they're like, the Lord bless you. And Boaz said to his young man, and the young man was like, there's this girl, she's Moabite. She's doing this like leaning thing. She took a break. He points that out. And Boaz went up to Ruth and was like, listen, do not go into another field or leave this one, but keep close to my young women. He says, have I not charged the young men not to touch you? And she said, she fell on her face, bowing to the ground, and said to him, why have I found favor in your eyes that you should take notice of me, since I am a foreigner? But Boaz answered her, all that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told to me. How you left your father and mother in your native land and came to people that you didn't know before. The Lord repay you for what you've done, and a full reward be given you by the Lord, the God of Israel, whose wings you have come to take refuge. Under whose wings? Then she said, I have found favor in your eyes, my Lord, talking to Boaz, for you have comforted me and spoken kindly to your servant, though I am not one of your servants. And at mealtime, Boaz said to her, come here and eat some bread and dip your morsel in the wine. So she sat beside the reapers. He passed to her roasted grain, and she ate until she was satisfied, which, if you remember, I harped on this. They're in the middle of a famine, and this girl just got to eat till she was satisfied. I love eating till I'm satisfied. I've never been part of a famine, so I can't imagine I would imagine she was emotional, because then she had some left over, and we know who she's taking that home to. When she rose to glean, Boaz instructed his young men, saying, "Let her glean even among the sheaves, and do not reproach her. And also pull out some bundles for her, and leave it for her to glean, and don't rebuke her." So did Ruth know that Boaz was doing this? That he was like making it to where she could have more? No. It said, when she rose to glean, he turned to his guys and was like, "Yo, leave some stuff out, leave some extra." He did not let her know. He did this purely to benefit her, not to be praised himself. Boaz considers her feelings by making sure her needs are met, but not drawing attention to the fact that he was doing it. I thought that was spoke to his character. And so she gleaned in the field until evening. She beat out what she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley. And an ephah of barley is no small amount of dollar bills. Like, he was giving up. An ephah of barley is 10 omers, okay? And 1 omer was enough manna to feed someone for a day. So Boaz is like losing money on this arrangement. So the last few verses, and then we're going to kind of go to the main point. She took it up and went to her city. Her mother-in-law Naomi saw what she had gleaned. She also brought out and gave her what food she had left over after being satisfied. And her mother-in-law said to her, "Where did you glean today, and where have you worked? Blessed be the man who took notice of you." So she told her mother-in-law with whom she'd worked, and said, "The man with whom I worked today is Boaz." And Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, "May he be blessed by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead." Now remember Naomi of last week? What was she like? Yes. What was her new name? Mara. Yeah. So this is quite an emotional turnaround for Naomi. To feel so empty and so forgotten, and then suddenly for this huge win for them that she is identifying obviously as being from God. Naomi said to her, "This man is a close relative of ours." More on that in a few chapters. "One of our redeemers." And Ruth the Moabite said, "Besides, he said to me, 'You shall keep close by my young men until they have finished all my harvest.' And Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, 'It is good, my daughter, that you go out with his young women, lest in another field you be assaulted.' So she kept close to the young women of Boaz, gleaning until the end of the barley and wheat harvests, and she lived with her mother-in-law." Okay. So going back to verse 8. Boaz said to Ruth, "Now listen, my daughter. Do not go to glean in another field, or leave this one, but keep close to my young women. Let your eyes be on the field they are reaping, and go after them. Have I not charged the young men not to touch you? And when you're thirsty, go to the vessels and drink what the young men have drawn." So this statement from Boaz is effectively the first anti-sexual harassment policy recorded in the Bible. Naomi actually reiterates what Boaz said. It's interesting because Ruth misquotes Boaz. In verse whatever, where is it? 22? Yeah, right, 21. Ruth says, "Besides, he said to me, 'You'll keep close by my young men until they finished all the harvest.'" And Naomi said, "Oh, honey, he said, 'It is good, my daughter, that you go out with his young women.'" Boaz even said young women, because Naomi knows. I think Ruth, this naive quality about Ruth, it is on some level a wonderful thing to be naive about sexual violence, right? So you can't blame her, but Naomi's been around a while. And so she really points out kind of the darker side of what this could be and says, "You keep close to his young women, lest in another field you be assaulted." Naomi reiterates what Boaz initially said, which was, "Stick with my girls." One can only wonder about the situation for other poor women who were working at the sides of the fields and had to withstand the rape culture that likely pervaded the male pickers, crassness, insults, and physical harassment. Naomi was right to be thankful to God that Ruth was a woman who was protected in Boaz's field. At the end of the book of Judges, so Judges, Ruth, right, in the song? That's how it goes. Judges then Ruth in the Bible. We read about a really tragic story about the concubine of Gibeah. Are you familiar with this story? The concubine of Gibeah or Gibeah. So I'm going to read an excerpt of this, and it's pretty distressing if you haven't read it before. It is in your Bible. This is in Judges 19. And do remember that the chapter in Judges starts with, now in those days, Israel had no king. So Judges 19, verse 22. While they were enjoying themselves, okay, backstory, Amber. This guy is traveling. It's kind of irrelevant, but it's relevant, but irrelevant. He's traveling, and he's like, we're going to go. And they're like, no, you should stay. And they're like, oh, well, you can stay here. And he's like, okay, I'll go. And he's bringing his concubine with him. Basically, this dude is traveling. He's from Ephraim, or whatever. The point is, this guy's traveling, and he's staying at someone's house. He is a visitor. Anyways, so verse 22. While they were enjoying themselves, and these are God's people, okay? While they were enjoying themselves, a crowd of troublemakers from the town surrounded the house. So the man is enjoying the evening with the people who are hosting him, and they're all hanging out, eating, drinking, whatever. And a crowd of troublemakers from the town surround the house where this guy is staying. They began beating at the door and shouting to the old man, the guy who lives there, bring out the man who's staying with you so we can have sex with him. The old man stepped outside to talk to them and said, no, my brothers, don't do such an evil thing. For this man is a guest in my house, and such a thing would be shameful. Here, take my virgin daughter and this man's concubine. I will bring them out to you, and you can abuse them and do whatever you like. But don't do such a shameful thing to this man. But the crowd wouldn't listen to him. So the Levite took hold of his concubine and pushed her out the door. The men of the town abused her all night, taking turns raping her until morning. Finally, at dawn, they let her go. At daybreak, the woman returned to the house where her husband was staying. She collapsed at the door of the house and lay there until it was light. When her husband opened the door to leave, there lay his concubine with her hands on the threshold. He said to her, get up, let's go. But there was no answer. So he put her body on his donkey and took her home. When he got home, he took a knife and cut up his concubine's body into 12 pieces. Then he sent one piece to each tribe throughout all the territory of Israel. Everyone who saw it said, such a horrible crime has not been committed in all the time since Israel left Egypt. Think about it. What are we going to do? Who's going to speak up? So the book of Ruth is placed immediately after this end part of Judges. There's a book called Josephus, which is not included in our canon. It is an historical text. And Josephus actually seems to think that Ruth is part of the book of Judges, because that's the time in which Ruth is set. The very first verse in Ruth said, in the days when the judges ruled, there was famine in the land. If we read Ruth as an appendix to Judges, it follows immediately after the violent story of the gang rape of the concubine of Gibeah, whose husband offers her to the mob to protect himself, which, if you're familiar with the rest of the story, it leads to a civil war ending in the kidnapping of the girls from Shiloh. The rape culture is endemic, widespread, disease-like in both cultures, in both stories. Rape culture is just the culture. In the concubine story, however, the woman is betrayed by her own husband, while in Ruth, Boaz comes to her rescue and protects her, a man who is not tied to her in any marriage or legal obligation that is known of at this time, and he owes her nothing. One commentator noted, the book of Ruth is a hopeful alternative to the terrible story of the concubine, who is left outside, unsuccessful in her attempt to cross the threshold and pass the night in peace. In Ruth, we find that even concerning a foreign woman, in every sense, there is a moral imperative for individuals and society to take care of her, as Boaz decided, and ensure that she survives the night, both metaphorically and literally. The entire congregation that we can think of ourselves presently, and in effect, the entire future kingdom will benefit from this process. Ruth represents an opportunity for rectification and continuation. So we spend a lot of time, I've spent a lot of time in the past in ladies' classes when we talk about Ruth, talking about how to be like Ruth. There are a lot of ways that I want to be like Ruth, but I also really want to be like Boaz. I want to be a lot like him. Judges 17:6 says, "In those days there was no king in Israel, and everyone just did what was right in their own eyes." So we see this, and it was so fitting. Mike talked about that today. We see this in our culture today with moral relativity. Moral relativism says that there's no such thing as like a universal or absolute set of moral principles, if you're familiar with this concept. Think of the phrase like living your truth and doing your thing. That is the modern day doing what is right in his own eyes. It's the same thing. Boaz is living counterculturally. Boaz is taking care of a woman at his own expense. Boaz is taking care of a foreigner at his own expense and not expecting to receive anything in return. Boaz is knowingly taking care of a widow as well, who is someone who cannot and will not be contributing to the workforce. We have the man who forked over his concubine in Judges to literally save his own skin, and then barked about how unjust her rapists were. And then we have Boaz, who could have let his workers rape Ruth. It probably would have made him more popular, honestly. It wouldn't have cost him a dime, but he didn't. He went, as one might say, above and beyond. So there's two examples here. That brings us to a focused question for today. One man goes with the culture, moves with the crowd, and did what was right in his own eyes. The other man did what was right in God's eyes. How can we be like Boaz? If we are in a Boaz position, how do we honor God? What is culture now? If we're going to be counterculture, we have to identify what culture is now.
So culture currently says, I give and let people know that I'm giving. Right? So therefore counterculture is, I give in silence. Right? I help someone else out and no one else knows.
Yeah. Social media has made it very hard to do anything privately. You can, but there is this compulsion to share it. And I love social media. I love Facebook. I love the way I get little windows into people's worlds, and I get to learn from other people. It's not a bad thing to share, but your motives.
Culture today is a me world,
Mm-hmm.
and counterculture is taking others into consideration first.
Yeah. I think of how Boaz took care of someone at his own expense, and sometimes you hear like what goes around comes around, in a bad way, but also a good way. Like the universe will give back to me. I hear people say that all the time. Like if I pay it forward, it'll come back, and it's like pay it forward and never expect it to come back, because when you give to someone who has no means, when you give to a Naomi, she cannot give back to you. Like, it's not possible. But you see, when you give to a Naomi and you give to a Ruth, generations are blessed in ways that Boaz could not even anticipate.
You think about Christ coming through the
Yeah.
line.
Yeah. And that's why what was his name? It's like the commentator up here said it was a time for rectification and continuation. The fact that Boaz took this on, and instead of letting it be wrong, because letting something be wrong, it can be very passive. But choosing to make it right, that was action. Boaz could have just been hands off, let men touch Ruth all they needed to, all they wanted to. She still had to glean for her life. But being hands-on and making it right, and how that story rolls out that we'll see in the next couple weeks, choosing to do something changed forever. And God was going to make it happen, you know. If it was, just like it says in Esther, if not you, someone else. Like, if not Boaz, someone else. But it was Boaz because of what he did.
I think we all have vulnerable people around us, you know, and so being hands-on and without, like Tamika was saying, you know, without the glory, he didn't tell her, hey, I'm gonna do this for you.
Yeah.
You know, he just did it. So, you know, just keeping our eyes open and being aware and watching for the vulnerable.
Yeah.
Because you don't have to be rich and powerful to have people that are more vulnerable than you. Every one of us have people that are more vulnerable than we are.
Makes me wonder how Boaz got to be like Boaz, who taught him to keep his eyes open.
That's what I was thinking of, you know, we have children and
Yeah.
everybody's different, and God has a purpose. But I was thinking about Mike's lesson too, and I'm thinking about people today, like he was saying, they don't know. So many children have been raised without any knowledge of Jesus and God and right and wrong.
Yeah.
Basically because both parents are working, they don't even have a big home sometimes.
Yeah.
And so it's so important for children and so important for people to be teaching, being the light somewhere or other.
I think,
Whether it's
yeah.
cleaning or teaching or whatever it is.
Exactly what you're saying, especially about children. Loving children is countercultural. And that might sound weird, but we live in like a mommy wine culture where I have to recover from my children at night by taking the edge off because they're just too much. And like, trust me, I'm Patsy's mom. Like, I am battered and tired. Jeffrey's gone for a week. I'm also Rosemary's mom, but she's not there yet. Patsy never stops talking. I'm so tired. I don't know how many times I can say, that's so cool, before I explode. And I don't personally go home and drink something to take the edge off of my 5-year-old. That's not a choice that's not something I do. I'm not saying it's unwarranted, but there's a push sometimes to treat kids as like, they don't contribute, they annoy the snot out of me, you know. I think we've gotten a lot better about that culturally. But to intentionally love people's children, like, blows their mind. Because most people, I know Addie's talked about this, Meredith's talked to me about this, most of you probably have. The village up here at this church is crazy. People at my work cannot believe that how many people have helped us since we moved here. I drive 2 cars that I don't own, you know. And, like, I had a coworker that was floored by that. Like, he's like, I can't find a car, I'm sharing a car. He's like, where are your cars from? I said, I'm on loan from people at church. Just blew his mind. And so living in a village and loving each other's children as part of that, there's a million other ways to live in a village, is extremely countercultural. I wish I had hustled up at the beginning and talked faster so we could talk more about this. But I will not be here next week. I can either make an outline and someone else can do the next chapter of Ruth, or we can just wait. Huh? Okay, cool. Yeah. But yeah, that's it. That's all for today. Thank you for being here.